Hello and welcome back to the next part in our series of videos where we help you set up your Synology NAS right the very first time. And today in part 7 we're going to talk about the rather eggy subject of remote accessing your Synology NAS in the most secure way possible. I think it would be fair to say that those of you that have either reached the part in this guide series where we're going to talk about this, or those that have just skipped ahead right to this point, need to understand a few things right out the gate. Number one, this can often be the most pivotal moment changing your system from totally secure to danger wasteland. The raiders have just arrived. What we're doing today is talking about accessing the system for outside of the comfort and security of your local area network, your LAN. Now, there are multiple ways you can do this, so much so in fact that I'm kind of going to abridge this video into two halves from what you can see here. You can look on the timeline on the bottom of the screen. The first half is what I'm going to call easy mode. It's going to be the easier ways to establish a remote connection and ultimately allow you to do it in the most stress-free way possible. And although it's never going to be as safe as a closed local area network connection, these are going to be ones where you're utilizing pre-established routines and bouncing off of relay servers and ultimately using a third-party server to act as a go-between between you and your Synology NAS. The second half of this video is going to be delving into a lot more of the custom hands-on stuff and going into stuff like dynamic DNSs and creation there, utilizing VPN servers and ultimately allowing access via very specialized ports on your Synology NAS being allocated and opened up on your router. But bear in mind that there are frankly tens if not hundreds of thousands if not millions of different configurations you can opt for when creating a remote access port to your Synology NAS, so it's going to be impossible to cover them all, and not all of the steps in today's video are chronological. Sometimes other elements are going to be more appropriate to you, and indeed the setup of some of these options, from the adding of an encrypted certificate to your system to the setting up of the DDNS and port forwarding, can be done in a different order equivalent to your own setup needs there. So do bear that in mind. But let's get started with the easy half. Now, the one that a number of you have probably heard of and is arguably the most stress-free way to set up remote access to your Synology NAS, although not providing the huge amount of performance that some of you might want, is of course Synology's own system known as QuickConnect. Now, QuickConnect, as you can see here on screen, is a relay system. You've got your Synology NAS, you've got your own PC, represented apparently by my own head right now, and in the middle, the QuickConnect server. When you are trying to access your Synology NAS remotely, rather than a direct port of call into the system from wherever you are in the world, whether it is a secure office or a coffee shop, via a specific port you've opened up. In this method, what happens is you communicate with Synology server and then it communicates with your NAS. It does reduce performance, but it does ensure that you are going through an encrypted tunnel through Synology's own relay point there, and it's completely for free and you can set it up with the system very, very easily. Going into the control panel, go into the external access tab. Bear in mind you will need to have created a Synology account first. I hate seagulls. And you can do that right there at the bottom by going into Synology account and creating one. I've got one already set up here for this video. Going back into external access, you simply need to put a tick next to external connect and give your system a name. I've called it 1522 Guide NAS. And then from there, go into the advanced settings tab if you want to make sure that only specific services can be used via this relay point. So if you want to ensure, for example, that your mobile can access it, then you can make sure to use the mobile applications, but disallow anything else to be utilized there. But once you've got that selected, go ahead and click apply, and that's it. It's as straightforward as that. And it will issue you the public URL that you can use. This URL that's meant to be on screen, this one here will allow you to pop that into a URL, any computer in the world, and it'll allow you to get into the system. Now, obviously, there is an inherent security worry there. You've now got a findable identity. Unlike when it was a local access and you had your system on just a nice IP behind all the closed doors of your layer 2-3 switch, your router and all of the firewall stuff in between. Now we've actually got a point where your system can be bounced in via Synology server. So do bear that in mind. And fair play to Synology, I've got to say, particularly in the latest revisions of their services, particularly with adaptive logins and IP checks and stuff like that. It's actually got a lot harder to get into a Synology NAS remotely if you're utilizing a non-recognized system. So often the admin and the password, the username, be admin or otherwise, and the password isn't enough. In a lot of cases, you actually need to provide additional information and verification via the Synology account to get access, but it's not foolproof. And of course, if you can get into the login page, if a vulnerability can be exploited somewhere there, because it wouldn't be impossible, again, we are still talking decimal place percent here, still nonetheless, this is the easiest way by a country mile to access your Synology NAS remotely, with the added benefit, for example, if we copy that link and go into an incognito window, if you're in the house or in your office, as you can see there from the top left, the QuickConnect identity will convert into a local IP when it identifies that it is being accessed remotely, but utilizing a local access device, and it will carry it over once you log in there, or you can maintain and continue with that remote access credential if you choose. But that is not the only easy way to remote access, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail in this video, but I will say, if you aren't totally in love with using Synology's own relay server, which I'm not going to say is weird given you've already put your eggs in their basket, so to speak, but if you're already utilizing a couple of pre-established remote access tools known as TeamViewer or Tailscale, then I would definitely recommend integrating those into your setup. These allow you to use encrypted VPN tunnels, or at least in the case of Tailscale, to establish connections between your devices. What do I mean by that? Well, in the case of Tailscale, if you use a normal VPN by comparison, normal VPNs will have to go through a VPN point, and we'll talk about that in the second half of this video about setting up a VPN server. But ultimately, they involve everyone having to exchange through that VPN tunnel point there in order data to be exchanged. The way Tailscale works is Tailscale allows encrypted tunnels between pre-selected devices. You need to install Tailscale on individual devices, the application, as well as installing it on the NAS. Luckily, there is now an application in the App Center that allows you to install Tailscale directly, so you can install that on the system, and then from there assign it to a Tailscale account, and then install Tailscale on mobile or client devices to create those encrypted tunnel points there. As useful as that is, just bear in mind again, there is going to be a performance penalty, and we provided a whole video here setting up Tailscale on a Synology NAS. It's the complete setup there. We bridged several devices in this video and got them all connected together and allowed them to communicate securely, always utilizing certified connections between all devices. The alternative, of course, is to utilize Tailscale. Now, Tailscale has arguably been around for a very long time. It was one of the first tools I ever used for remote connectivity. Arguably the first ones I was using was remote desktop on Windows, but I think one of the first third-party polished UIs I utilized was TeamViewer. And TeamViewer, once you create a completely free account, businesses will need to use a paid subscription. It allows you to remotely tap into the full GUI of your Synology NAS remotely, again utilizing their own encrypted pathways there. Now, again, we did a whole video on this, but we did a video on this way back in 2019 when it first came out in beta. Although we should revisit it soon, it's worth highlighting that not a lot has changed, and it's still very, very good in terms of creating that remote access point between TeamViewer verified devices, and you really do need to verify with preset passwords every time, but it allows you to bridge the gap between all of those devices. And I'll link to this video in the description, but it will walk you through exactly how to set up TeamViewer on your Synology NAS and allow, once again, that easy access into all of the devices. Because as you can see from this diagram, much like we talked about with the Synology setup there, it is a case of utilizing the TeamViewer relay point in the middle to exchange and verify those requests, but they always need to be one password and username verified, and you have to have verified and trusted devices that will be checked every single time and needs to be added manually, even with the correct credentials to get in the very first time. And then moreover from that, the exchange of data still happens through encrypted tunnels, thereby ensuring that interlopers in the middle can't get hold of data, whether it's text data or larger being exchanged. Again, recommend checking out that video or some of the guides linked in the description for that one. But now, as we leave arguably the more easy part of this video and go into the more tech savvy one, it's worth highlighting that if you do want to directly access your Synology NAS without using any kind of third-party relay point. Although there are benefits in terms of performance, it's worth remembering that this brings with it a whole host of not only dangers and attack vectors, but also a technical NAS and setup that if you do wrong, you could really leave yourself open to attack. So I would have already stated that you need to go to at least step 6 in this guide series, where we covered securing your Synology NAS in terms of storage integrity, but obviously, of course, the integrity of connections and devices and accounts to your system. And before you go any further in any kind of remote access on your system, go through all the steps in part 6 of this video guide series, where we went through the solidification of the security barriers and layers of security and shields between the external and the internal of your Synology NAS, not just the data, but of course the system configuration and controls. But going forward with the necessary steps when setting up your system for the first time for remote access, probably one of the earliest things you need to get sorted is an encrypted certificate on your system to allow exchanges of data to be verified and checked, and particularly connected users that are using a secure connection before any exchange of data to the smallest kilobit of system config data is exchanged. Head into the control panel, and rather than go through all the options, which you can do, just put in the word certificate, or just put in half of that word, and from there you'll open up the tab within the security tab. We're going to be visiting this tab quite a lot, and you'll already see that we've got some certification in place. We've added these encrypted certificates, and you can go ahead and create brand new ones. You can even get a completely free one from Let's Encrypt via your system. You'll have to provide some further information, and we will be talking about domain naming services and more in just a moment. But again, getting an encrypted certificate is going to be important, and you're going to have to verify it against a domain to get that free certificate. Then we're going to be coming back to certificates later on, but with the majority of the services we're going to talk about, this is going to be a necessary step. The reason being that when you're on a local area network, you were kind of already utilizing that closed system, so it wasn't as important, although some IT admins will advise even having certified a certification in place, even on the local area network. But once you're going external, you need to know that the connected device and the portal it is using at either end of that tunnel is encrypted at either side, and certificates like this allow that to happen. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. We need to return now to the subject of DDNS. Is something we talked about a couple of videos ago. Now, DNS, or domain name services, ultimately what changes the number of selections and numbers of an IP, which is effectively the identity of even a website or a physical server even, and turns that into verbatim, words that we can actually understand. But a lot of the devices you've got on your local area network from your mobile phones, once you try to access the internet, they all funnel through a specific point. This is, if we get the right image up there, thank you Acer Store for this image, when you are having all of the devices in the local area network in your home or business, all of those devices here, the ones on the right, are going through a router. They may be going through a secondary router that's acting as a wireless access point for everyone else. Perhaps it's a mesh router system there. Maybe you're just utilizing a more comprehensive router, and then you're using the one provided by your ISP. Whichever way you look at it, you'll be filtering through one main router that is the gateway point between it and the internet services. And over here, you've got you accessing very, very far away. So periodically, your external doorway, which is your external IP, changes. You only have one external IP as far as your internet connection is concerned for all of those devices coming through, but that can change. And you even have groupings of external IPs provided by internet service providers there. And one of the biggest problems you're going to find if you're going to be creating a direct and hopefully secure access point to your NAS externally is if that IP changes, everything goes wrong. If you were trying to access NAS Compares, great website, check it out, and our IP of where our server with all the information and the articles and everything lived, our external IP changed, and we weren't keeping up with that, the site would not be accessible. So what this is about with the dynamic naming service is to turn it from a dynamic domain naming service into a dynamic domain naming service, is to ensure that our identity, our external IP, in the event of it changing, we can still access remotely, securely and stably. Now bear in mind, you might be a lucky, or let's be realistic, got a bit of money to burn, person who has already purchased a static external IP, because you're running remote access for lots of individuals and you need stability and you need high performance. Some of the steps I'm going to talk about throughout this video, including the one I'm about to discuss, they're not appropriate to you because you've already got a static IP. But for the majority of other users who are going to have dynamic IPs, this is going to be appropriate. So what you need to do is go ahead and start creating our dynamic IP using a DDNS service. There are loads available to create this for yourself, but Synology themselves do provide it in essence for just this system. Very important, because that's what we're applying on today. So firstly, we have to name our system, and this is again going to be the external identity of what this NAS is going to have. This doesn't immediately give external access because we've still got to do things like port forwarding and more, but we can give this system a name. We'll go for there, and this is going to be DS1522 NAS testing there. We've got our external IP there in the middle of the screen. It's presumably blurred out, but you never know. We are running through a mobile dongle here just to make sure. And then from there, we can go ahead and click test to establish that that external IP and that Synology.me domain is going to be operational. Once that's confirmed, we can talk a little bit more about that certified Let's Encrypt certificate. If you've not already created one earlier on with that registered domain, it is highly recommended to get one via these steps, and it will apply that certificate for this Synology DDNS via this portal here. So again, you can go ahead and put a tick there and begin that Let's Encrypt installation of the certificate into the settings there. Installation, probably not the right word for you guys there. But you've also got the heartbeat there. I recommend checking that out and utilizing that. Bear in mind, it helps if you've got notifications in place. And what this means is periodically the system will check whether the external access is down, and then you'll get a notification via the other already supported external means just to let you know. But of course, if they're all running through the same ISP, then chances are the notifications, if you're outside of that, you're not going to get anyway, because there'll be no way for it to report to your client devices or even report to the Synology account services. But nonetheless, I would recommend keeping that heartbeat on there just to ensure it comes through for you. Click OK. As you can see, that will change now the default certificate. Now, if you're only doing this for standard class file access services, you've not got too much to worry about. But I would still recommend to double check that you haven't got pre-existing apps and services that are using or at least were calibrated towards a different certificate. What do I mean? You might be utilizing remote access for backups. You might be, NAS to NAS or NAS to cloud services. You may be utilizing certain external access points for things like Active Backup Suite. These will require that certificate to be adapted to what we've now set up. Otherwise, they will not verify the level of protected encryption during those connections, because the certification is not correct. So we need to head back into the control panel in order to change those. Once the web server has restarted there, as it was prompting on screen, head into the security tab, and then from there head into the certificate tab. Now find the certificate you either created earlier on or created in the creation of your DDNS, and then from there highlight it and click settings, and you'll find here the settings that are actually going to be utilizing this DDNS, and make sure that you allow VPN later on, if you have installed it, we'll revisit that later on, to be utilizing that certificate there. So you'll need to change it over if you are going to go ahead and use VPN services. If you're not, don't worry about it, you can leave it by default. And the same goes for any other service that you may be utilizing that is currently using Synology certificate there. If you want to migrate it over to the new one that we've created for that DDNS certified connection there. So again, you can set that up, and the same goes within the settings of advanced tabs there. Again, I wouldn't play around with these. If you don't know what you're doing, it's really not worth it to knock around with those. But now you've created that encrypted certificate on your system, and you've decided and reselected which system services are going to be going through that, and that certificate applies to. Why don't we make our way forward onto the next big thing? VPN Server is something that arrived with your Synology NAS. Again, it is available in the App Center. It's one of their first-party applications. Go ahead and install this. Once you've installed VPN Server, let's open that bad boy up, because what we're going to be doing now is creating an encrypted tunnel into your Synology NAS. But moreover than that, we're actually going to be creating an access point into the local area network. Now, why is that important? Well, VPN, you must have heard the term VPN client, VPN server, and just the term VPN thrown around quite a lot. The main things we should focus on there is VPN server is when we are going to be creating that access point into the Synology NAS and therefore the rest of the local area network to a point. Now, a VPN client is what you're going to be utilizing to access a pre-existing VPN. A lot of these, you hear about all these, like, was it Nord and all the different millions and squillion Norton VPN, all the different VPNs that are in the market that allow you to use those encrypted fuzzy points to access the wider internet and hide your identity. Now, a VPN server doesn't really work in that way as such. What it acts as is a way to securely access the local area network, but the activities that you do within the NAS or now the assumed local area network identity, they will still be working through the internet service provider, which means that that activity will be recorded. It just means it won't be recorded in the remote access point you are in. Now, when you're using a VPN server, there are some options open to you. Some of you have actually added 3 different options there. Ignore the last one. I'll be straight with you. The top one, point-to-point protocol. That will mean that you will be able to access the system in a slightly less encrypted fashion, but at the same time it will still allow remote level access via a VPN server, but these days it has been largely superseded by the support of OpenVPN. Now, OpenVPN does require you to use client tools, not dissimilar to what we were talking about earlier on with Tailscale, for these to act as an additional form of verification on the client side and the server side, but this is still a great way to remote access into the NAS in a secure fashion, as well as, assuming local area network connectivity. It can actually be used in quite a number of useful ways to create SMB and basic local access connectivity with the NAS via remote fashion. Something in the region, although arguably a less secure comparison, looking at things like WebDAV. So I would recommend going OpenVPN anyway for the sake of a balance between security and stability. If you want to go ahead with that, select OpenVPN server there. Again, your dynamic IP address is ultimately where you're going to be funneling into. This is what you are going to be assuming as the IP. This is ultimately the identity you're going to be utilizing within this setup here. You can change it. Again, look at IPs traditionally, like even the one I'm coming in at locally at 192.168.1.164. There are a million squillion different permutations really to go with there. I'm not going to bother changing it just in case you don't, but I do recommend you change it. And I will also add that you need to make a special note of that port later on, but we'll come to that later on. You can pretty much change, well, you don't have to change too much. I would definitely, depending on your usage scenario, increase that number. If it is just you, then keep it at that, but just bear in mind when you're utilizing this service, think not just about the number of active servers, but the number of active simultaneous client devices there. So leave it at 5 if you're concerned. You can always scale it up later via this configuration tool. From there, you're going to need to make sure that per account, if you're utilizing, say, a mobile phone, a desktop, and more, you might want to limit those down to 1 device or maybe even 2 devices, for security, but also for network congestion. Next, the port, randomize the hell out of that, but to be honest, I'm not going to bother changing it here, but I could change it to absolutely anything else. We just need to make sure we remember that number later on when we go through the oh-so-fun world of port forwarding here later on, which is always a bummer. And again, we will have to talk about that because it will be different for every single user. Next up, when we go down there, it's worth highlighting towards the bottom. We need to talk just a little bit there about accessing a server's LAN, whether you want that to actually be a thing, whether you want to be able to access things like security cameras or even network printers, although that's not really a thing in Synology DSM 7.2 anymore. But you can still access and allow them remote access to the devices there on the network. And as mentioned with point-to-point protocol, it's actually a great deal more secure to use OpenVPN. I think PPTP hits 128-bit encryption, but you can really go Johnny Big Bananas here utilizing OpenVPN. Keep it as secure as you like, but just bear in mind, the higher the security level, that often can degrade the max level of performance that you can expect to get. Once that's done, go ahead and click apply, and from there it's also worth highlighting that we need to make sure that only preset apps and services have the ability to utilize these features. As you can see, we are going to need to talk a little bit about port forwarding on that port we've selected for this service at 1194 there. So we come out of there. Before we go any further, again with general services there, make sure you bond this to a specific physical port. So as you can see there, I've got 4 ports on this particular NAS. I've only got 1 actually connected, so you can make sure, for example, that this port here is going for a very specific connection there. If you've got multiple LAN ports there, so say the other 3 are to wider access services on the LAN, like security cameras again, or other NASs for backups, you can make sure that this is physically bonded to a very specific port for you there. And again, as mentioned in part 6, make sure you set your auto blocks up. Make sure, because again, you are opening up a system now with a remote access naming there, that means it's findable in a way that it wasn't before. So setting up individual login attempts when the login page can be remotely accessible outside. Again, luckily using OpenVPN, you can limit that significantly using the client tools, but still nonetheless, I would lower these numbers down significantly lower and heighten the cooldown there. Make sure your notifications are in place as well to ensure that you get those notifications if someone is trying to DOS or trying to just brute force their way into your NAS. The same goes, and again, I know I'm repeating some of the stuff from the previous video, but just to be sure, make sure you ensure that your checks of connected users are in place quite significantly there. If you do have enhanced browser compatibility by skipping IP checking, IP and browser checking, uncheck that if you're going to go remote access, because again, once you get to the wider access world, that is more users trying to exploit people's systems, which means they may be using custom browsers, and having this unticked just hopefully minimizes the attack vector there once you're identifying and ultimately opening the doors to the internet. Lowering that attack vector further, just make sure that only specific power users or non-power users, depending on how you want to work this, have access via the OpenVPN tunnel we are creating here. So for example, there's 2 schools of thought. Number 1, only give admins access to it. That would mean that if only admins can access this service, only they can utilize it to perform configuration. But again, there is the school of thought that is, if you're only going to give a power user remote access, that means the only means of access is the most powerful system wrecking account there is. So you could have it so that a remote access admin can actually use a different connection, such as utilizing that Synology service we talked about, Tailscale or Teamview, whereas low-level access users that will not have the power user status or credentials or access, not only to shared folders, but system configuration, can then use it. The 2 schools of thought, pick the one that's appropriate to your own setup. Moreover, when you've created that public identity there and access to the NAS, rather than utilizing proprietary tools to tap in when you're using things like Microsoft Office 365 or Google Workspace and stuff like that to use services on the Synology NAS, you can actually go into the control panel in the Advanced tab and enter a lot of that information as well that you've created thus far to allow those to work semi-autonomously. But just again, stay on top of the logs, stay on top of the activity of the system, and make sure that when you do have an admin power user scenario where they need to be able to shut things down, that they at least can get in at a moment's notice remotely. Just maybe abridge it slightly or run it parallel to the existing remote access services for your lower level security clients. Now, a number of you have almost certainly already set up a firewall. If you haven't already set up a firewall, get on that. Go into the security tab, go to the firewall tab and enable it. Now, again, perhaps you were utilizing the system with no remote access and therefore you never felt the need to use it. Indeed, by default, the firewall is disabled by Synology. But I do strongly recommend that you have it enabled. Now, what does that do? It ultimately works as a blocker between the outside world and your NAS. But remember, your router has firewall settings. Your router has total port control as well. So we'll get onto that in just a moment. When it comes to the firewall, though, if you are going to be utilizing remote access patterns that we've described and creating that public identity for you to pick up with via DDNS or some of the other methodology, go into your firewall and make sure you've allowed access to those. So enabling firewall here because my firewall's already enabled, head down, select the drop down, select Manage Firewall Profile. From the Manage Firewall Profile, click Create. From there, click Create again. And as you can see here, we've got the ports and the source IP. So this is when you're going to want to make sure that one or more users are accessing the Synology NAS, and if you have set it that way, the LAN for that, identity for them, you're going to need to make sure that the firewall allows for that, and you're going to have to repeat a number of these steps here with your own router supplied to you by your internet service provider. Select from a list of built-in applications, and from there select the applications that you're going to allow that access. So for example, when I've been using VPN Server, I'm going to want to make sure I allow VPN Server access via that port I created earlier, 1194, because that's the port there that I'm going to need the firewall while it's blocking everyone to go, you may proceed. So go ahead and click that. And again, if you are going to be utilizing that access point for other means, you can go ahead and allow those if need be. Once that's allowed, make sure you give it a specific IP that it can work with there. And we're going to be using a range. We want to use a very specific subnet there because we may have individual different users coming in via their own, remote access IPs or different accounts there. So again, we utilize that bog standard IP address that it provided us earlier on, but just make sure you make note of that IP address from earlier on. And when it comes to the subnet, again, it's fairly usual to be 255.255.0 to go through. If you want to go for a very specific IP range there, you can go ahead with that option and just filter in IP ranges 5 through 10 and stuff like that if you really want to minimize the attack vectors to quite a substantial degree. Go ahead and click OK to continue, and you've created that VPN firewall rule there, and go ahead and click OK. Make sure you give this new profile a name before you forget, like I did. And then from there, go ahead and click OK. So now your firewall has now established and allowed the ruling for traveling through that port for your VPN server and remote access, external to look like internal there. Now, the next step is just going to be very unfortunate that it's going to be very difficult to show you at all. And that is when you're going to be going through setting up your port forwarding. Now, this is when things get real dicey, because everything I've talked up to this point is utilizing a Synology NAS. It's utilizing the Synology NAS and configuring the Synology NAS in the way that I want. And I have a lot of control, as mentioned in step 6, of so many layers of protective red tape and warning. But when it comes to your router from your ISP, the less you pay, if you're a home user, for example, the fewer features you will have. Internet service providers are starting to roll out more and more with port forwarding controls and configuration, but they slap all kinds of warnings if you want to dick around with it there. What you're ultimately doing is poking holes in the fence. You are poking holes in the walls. You're allowing people ways to get in. Now, it is advisable that you make sure that you don't do this unless you know what you're doing. Also, every internet service provider's router will differ, so it's very, very tough for you. But look for things such as port forwarding, DMZ port triggering. All of these options here will allow you to find on any internet service provider router to get into port forwarding and interject that port that we have created there in order to create that remote access credential, utilizing the port that we assigned earlier on during the OpenVPN creation there. Now we've created that OpenVPN access point via VPN server, and you've gone to the trouble of going into your ISP router and starting opening up ports, the very specific ports we have opened up, at least for that setup. The next thing we need to do is establish a connection via OpenVPN on the client devices you are using to the Synology NAS, and if you set it up that way, the rest of that local area network there. So download the tools you need, but that is only half the battle. The other thing you need to do is go back into the Synology NAS, reopen VPN server. From there, go to the OpenVPN option at the bottom, scroll down, remember to take note of that port there, and export that configuration. You'll download a file here, OpenVPN. It will be a little zipped up file there. Go in and unzip that file. Go into OpenVPN. There is a README to give you guidance on exactly what to do, but what we need to do is open that with a text editor. So in my case, I'm going to use good old-fashioned Notepad, open that up, and as you can see, there is the server IP. Now remember, depending on the server IP you've used, if you've kept it to the numbers, fine, enter them there. But in my case, what I've gone ahead with is when I use my DDNS, I created that new DDNS identity there with Synology.me. So that's the one I'm going to be entering into that text document there. Once you've added that on there, that's pretty much it. You're going to need to save up that file and save it. Then when you make your way into one of the client applications, again, this will come down to Android, iOS, Windows, Mac, whatever, that file that you've just saved there, that file is going to be your gateway into that system. Ultimately from here, this is all it needs. You can drag and drop it into the client app if you're using a desktop, or you can just upload it directly. But all this is the information they need. You'll still need to log into the Synology NAS utilizing the account details that you've created. And again, if you have made sure that specific users do have access via the DDNS and Synology's VPN server application, again, you could double check if users have got access. So if we go into the user groups there, find a user, decide whether they have access or not, permissions within their system. But ultimately, as long as you're using an active user who has access to OpenVPN via the application, let's bring that back up there, and you can go ahead with privileged users. As long as you're using a user that has access to OpenVPN, they should be able to utilize OpenVPN via the DDNS that you created to get in via OpenVPN and that VPN tunnel there. But just bear in mind again that what you are doing when you are in that LAN, or that mystical fake LAN, you are doing so on that ISP. So what you are doing there is not necessarily untracked. This is about communication with the device and the appearance of being on the LAN. There's a lot more to than that, and there are lots of ways in which you can actually reassume the identity and indeed the geolocational identity of the LAN even when you're far away, that you can go ahead with playing with that configuration file. But if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't really be touching that. But there you go, those are some of the recommended ways I would stay on remote accessing your NAS. And remember, I cannot keep saying this enough, make sure you watch part 6 where we talk about, solidifying and making your NAS as robust as possible before you go down the road of remote access credentials there. And again, as mentioned in the intro, all the steps in today's video are not necessarily in a chronological order, some of which you may already have done, such as the firewall, or already getting your certificate Let's Encrypt or otherwise in place. It's okay, you can reorder some of the steps, but just double check and revisit some of those earlier steps, like the certificate that's being utilized by individual apps and services, just to make sure they're all going through the same doorway. In the next part in this series, we're going to be looking at advanced storage technique. We've already talked about setting up your NAS and your storage in a very traditional fashion, but there is more to it than that, and there are lots of recovery and doubling down on some of the security of your data in terms of its integrity that we can go down on, and that will be in the next video. But apart from that, if you need further support or information, check out NAS Compare's free advice section, free NAS builder on the right hand side. When it comes to the free advice section, not only is there our Discord and Ask.NAS Compare's community support forum, there is recommended third party and first party forums along with subreddits that we recommend. The free advice section gives you support within 3 to 5 working days completely for free, or you can get expedited support within 24 hours working day if you need it there. Head over to Ko-Fi if you want to take advantage of that, or our membership tiers to get regular expedited services along with early access to content, exclusive content, monthly Zooms and content polls. Alternatively, head over to the services tab in both Ko-Fi and Patreon to hire me or Eddie for a Zoom consultation where we can look at your setup or make advisory suggestions to improve upon it. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.